Four Russia-controlled regions of Ukraine are annexed on Friday, and analysts wonder how will Russian annexation change the war in Ukraine, and could the war go nuclear? Nord Stream. Russia has hinted the US is behind explosions of the Nord Stream pipeline, raising the question if the Nord Stream pipeline gas leak was an act of sabotage. And finally, the US makes Pacific Islands pledge in bid to counter China. So how is the Indo-Pacific influences by the US and China? And what's the trajectory of their future relations? This is All 24 News special coverage. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Karim Fazakari, and before we bring in our guest, here is the latest. At least 23 people were killed and 28 wounded in a Russian missile strike that hit a convoy of civilian vehicles in Zaporizhia earlier. Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared the independence of Zaporizhia and Kherson in Ukraine as Moscow prepares to formally proclaim the annexation of Ukrainian territory. As a response, US President Joe Biden said Washington will not recognize Moscow's annexation as parts of Ukraine. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also condemned Russia's annexation of Ukrainian regions.
And with your permission, I'd also like to briefly address the shameless and transparent effort by Russia to annex parts of neighbor Ukraine. The United States, I want to be very clear about this, the United States will never recognize Russia's claims on Ukraine's sovereign territory. This so-called referendum was a sham, an absolute sham. The results were manufactured in Moscow.
Any decision to proceed with the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine would have no legal value and deserves to be condemned. Any decision by Russia to go forward will further jeopardize the prospects for peace. It will prolong the dramatic impacts on the global economy, especially developing countries, and hinder our ability to deliver life-saving aid across Ukraine and beyond.
Right, let's bring in our guest. We have via Skype Mr. Ivan Vershtuk, an editor at the New Voice of Ukraine from Kiev. And from Paris, France, we have Mr. Manuel Pouchelet, political analyst. And from Beijing, China, is Zheng Shenhui, a journalist of CGTN, China National Television. Gentlemen, madam, thank you indeed for agreeing to be with us. And let's kick it off with you, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet. If the referendum isn't legitimate, why is it so significant? And why even bother to hold a referendum in the first place if it's not going to be recognized anyhow?
Yes, I know today the referendum organized by Russia in the occupied territories of Ukraine, I think, is a big mess. Because Mr. Putin is facing with a lot of difficulties in this war, and he would like to legalize this new conquest. And concerning the history about annexions, we have already an experience in that field. It was in Europe, for example, in France, in 1914, when we had the first start of World War I. It was also because of the annexion of French territory by Germany at this time. But concerning this situation, I think the big challenge for Mr. Putin is after the war will be the stabilization period. Mm-hmm. Because when you are organizing military operations on territories, the big challenge for the new troops is the non-neutrality of the population, of course, and the stabilization phases will start. And I think it will be a real challenge, and Mr. Putin will face with a lot of difficulties. Also, this annexion is an answer to his economic situation, because he's going to have a hand on resources on Ukraine, and this is one of the main challenge for Mr. Putin too. So that's why this conquest, this new conquest, is unbelievable. And Mr. Biden said he won't recognize this claim, of course.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. Ivan Vershtuk? Is the annexation going to set the stage for another escalation? How will the annexation of Ukraine, or let's say these territories by Russia, change the war in Ukraine? And after the referendum, are even peace talks possible now?
The main change that's going to happen now is that Russian administration will bring police to those Ukrainian regions, as well as bureaucracy, while also maybe teachers, prosecutors, all kind of civil servants with Russian passports. Then the safety and the security situation in the occupied lands is going to deteriorate. We know very well what Russian police does when it comes to occupied lands. We saw that in Crimea in 2014, and we start seeing that now. They stop all the men on the streets, check their documents, and those men might be forcefully mobilized to serve whether in the Russian police or the Russian army, which will definitely be met with resistance by the pro-Ukrainian people on the occupied territories. The second thing, after Ukrainians saw the news about the annexation that's happening right now, and that's not going to be recognized by any democratic power in this planet, Ukrainians have this growing demand for the Ukrainian army to increase the intensity of its operations both in the eastern and in the southern operational zones. So there is, political pressure on the Ukrainian army to act faster, to bring Ukrainian rule and Ukrainian government officials to the places that are expecting to be liberated by the Ukrainian army. The life on the occupied territories is unbearable. There is no safety. There are major interruptions with electricity supplies, with gas supplies, with water supplies. That's why Russians are now trying to bring own electricity grid and own gas pipeline to those lands. So it would be disconnected from Ukraine's infrastructure. That's like the next big thing. And also, I think the risk is that after the annexation, the illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, Russia will start planning more operations that will affect other parts of southern Ukraine. Basically, Kremlin wants to gain control over all of the Ukrainian land, all the way to Moldova, where Transnistria is that has own presence of Russian troops. So right now we're in this really complicated situation with the war, where the army, the Ukrainian army, will have to start working more intensively, and with the new Western artillery supplies, that's probably going to be possible.
So there is no room for any peace talks. It seems that the peace talks are going to be impossible, Mr. Vershtuk. And according to your analysis, it seems that the conflict is going to linger on, let's say, and of course the operation is going to be intensified by the borders. Just to sum up what you were saying, and let me please bring in Mrs. Zhang Shenghui. What can you tell us about the measures that can be done amidst nuclear threats? And do you think that these are real nuclear threats, or it's just perhaps buying time? What is it exactly? Could the war in Ukraine really go nuclear?
I can't predict for now if it is really a nuclear threat or not, but we can see that now the situation is kind of very dangerous now. And we can't say if today it is in control or out of control, but we can see that if nothing is done for now, there will be a crescendo in the future. So it is time. It is also the Chinese position to saying that the pressing priority today in Ukraine is to facilitate peace talks with the US, with the Russia, and China supports all efforts to the peaceful resolution for this crisis in Ukraine, and especially for the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told the United Nations General Assembly on Saturday, and saying that China wants to see a kind of peace talks continuing these two sides. But for now, we're thinking that things are still very dangerous now, what's happening. But again, I would say that when we see that what's happening today with the energy shortage today in Europe, with the energy shortage today around the world, with inflation problems, economic problems caused by this issue, caused by these tensions between the Russia and Ukraine. I mean, we're all losers. China is loser, and Europe is loser. Perhaps there's only the US who is getting profits from this situation.
Very nice indeed. And let me bring in Mr. Manuel Pushley again. Mr. Manuel Pushley, you heard our distinguished guests. One of them said that there will be an escalation. And of course, Ukraine is obligated actually to intensify its effort by the borders in an attempt, let's say, to regain its lost territories from Russia, while Russia is threatening of using nuclear weapons. And here we have our journalist, Zhang Shanghui, who is saying that they are hopeful. Let's say a lot of parties are hopeful that perhaps negotiations and peaceful talks will take place. But Mr. Manuel Pushley, we see that the additional sanctions that will be imposed on Russia is not going to change anything. How do you see it, and how credible is the US in facing those who strategically challenge it?
I think that today one of the main actors in this conflict is USA, of course. And I think, according to what I know about the situation and about the contact I have in all these places, I can say that today the goal is to stop. We know that President Xi Jinping said that it's time to stop. It's time to stop this conflict because, of course, the Silk Belt Initiative is blocked. And also the economy of Russia, China, USA, and of course Europe is getting worse. And of course, I think that the signal of the worsened situation will come with the population with upset because of the increases of a lot of product. I'm talking about food, I'm talking about electricity, I'm talking about a lot of topics. On this situation, and today the population can't cope with that, of course. But I was listening carefully about the nuclear threat. According to the nuclear doctrine of use, concerning the military point of view, is the peace through the fear. It was imposed during the 1970s, but today I think if it is used, a tactical nuke is used, we think that it will be a bridge too far, and the red line is crossed. But what about the red line? The big problem is the definition of the red line. I think we have already crossed it. The goal is to stop this conflict, to help Ukraine to recover its lost territories, and of course, Europe. I think the main challenge is also for Europe to stop following USA and to try to open peace talk and opportunities and with Mr. Putin. But of course, I think the European Union did a mistake because it rushed about the Ukraine adhesion to the economic European Union. I think it's good, but we should do that in the long term, not in the short term. Just like to care a big problem, you know. So I think that today the challenge is to find out solutions for all parties who are involved in this conflict. But the first one is to help Ukraine to recover its own territory as it was before, maybe as it was also before 2014. And this is a challenge.
Very nice indeed. And speaking about the mistakes and maybe the threats of the nuclear or whatever that could contaminate, let's say, our environment, coming up next, Russia has hinted that the US is behind explosions which have badly damaged underwater Nord Stream gas pipelines running to Germany. And the pipelines may be unusable forever after major leaks. Is this an act of sabotage? Following the consecutive leaks in the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines under the Baltic Sea, the Russian president called the incident an act of international terror. This comes amid a war of accusations as to who should be held accountable for the attack.
Days of drama and finger-pointing still unable to face the guilty. Up to this stage, there is no concrete element to find those responsible for the leaks identified on the gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea, but the scenarios envisaged have already emerged. The Kremlin has published a statement in which it says that the Russian president told in a phone call his Turkish counterpart that this was an unprecedented act of sabotage that was due to an act of international terrorism on the 2 pipelines.
Unprecedented nature of this event, it looks like as some terrorists possibly committed on a state level, demands of very active and energetic cooperation. It's a very dangerous situation that requires urgent investigation.
Only a few days before Russia started what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine, here is what the US president said at that time.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
Moscow, which called for a meeting of the UN Security Council on Friday, accused the United States of being responsible, taking advantage of this old statement by Joe Biden, insinuations deemed ridiculous by Washington, D.C. European leaders have already decided this was an act of sabotage.
It's very likely that it has been done deliberately and not by accident, and it's very unlikely that it's been done by anybody else than a state without being detected earlier.
The incident signaled a point of no return. Analysts say the economic damage caused by these attacks is going to land Europe in a recession as deep as the one of 2009. A jeopardy made Norway to decide to boost security around its energy infrastructure after reports of an increase in unidentified drone flights in recent weeks.
Back to you, Mrs. Zhang Shanghui. There has been intense speculations as to who is responsible for these apparent attacks on these pipelines, and both sides have been blaming each other. And until there is a proper investigation, we can't really know who did what. But who, in your view, benefits the most from the damage of the pipelines?
Yes, we can't now yet decide who did actually cause the occurrence problems of this leak and this colossal leak. I would say that this is one of the most dangerous situations today, because when we look at the carbon dioxide, the emission of the carbon dioxide, it is very dangerous today to the global climate with the carbon dioxide leasing today. So this is the first thing. And second thing, that if we do look at the situation and who benefits the most from this situation, that's the U.S., who actually send and export the gas to Europe. And when we look at the price of the gas that was sent to Europe, and when we look at the price of the natural gas that when you buy it in the U.S., you find that this is a big difference. It is 8 times more expensive than what you can buy the same gas, natural gas that you buy in the U.S. So we can find that today, the European people, they're actually paying more. They're paying more to buy the gas, the natural gas, and on the same time, there's also an increasing number of European companies who are making steel, fertilizers, and other basic commodities that actually they can afford their operations, and they're moving some of the operations outside, especially to the United States, where energy prices are more stable. So we can see that there is a kind of danger in the industrialization in Europe, especially if there's some data released by IHS Markit with a data agency under the S&P Global. So we can see that there's a danger in industry, in the European industry today. So we can see that this problem are causing other problems. There's a kind of a butterfly influence today in all around the world, in the European industry and also in the global industry. And who benefits the most? I would say we can see that it is the U.S. who actually benefits the most from all these accidents and all these so-called accidents and what's coming after this.
What about you, Mr. Ivan Vershtuk? The timing of the damage is certainly very curious and suspicious. Who do you think benefits from these distractions, and why would Russia, as some are speculating, damage its own pipeline, which is going to be costly on its economy, while they can simply shut off the gas?
My version is this. Russian security services have always been capable of this, complicated strategies that are hard to understand at the first sight. During the World War II, the Russian army often was wearing a uniform of the German army for destroying peaceful civilians. And they thought those provocations are like a good tool for achieving their purposes. That's exactly what I think is happening right now. That it's Russian agents and special operators stand behind those pipeline leaks. And here's logic for this. Vladimir Putin thinks that if Russia stops supplying gas to the European Union, then it's the European Union that's going to be having losses and inflation and energy instability, while Russia will change the supply, the customers for their gas. They could sell gas to China. They could sell gas to Central Asian countries that need them. And, just simply cutting off the supplies to Europe without any sort of provocations or explosions and leaks would be too simple. While we know that Vladimir Putin likes to have this, strategic approach, what he says, and, to bring more chaos and instability and more negative developments into the European news. Right now, if you open up a web page or the Financial Times or any big other publication, you see how much instability is all over Europe. Like inflation is a 10-year high in Europe. In Netherlands, it's like almost 20%. And Vladimir Putin wants to increase this. He thinks that inflation is the biggest force that is able to ruin the Western coalition that is standing behind supporting Ukraine. He wants Europe and the United States also to pay the price for supporting Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's original plan was that the West was divided, but when he saw that the West not as divided as he expected, he's starting his energy war, which brings so much problems to all the countries all over the world, and also food crisis. So I think Russians are playing their own complicated game, and the other thing is that Russians are now trying to build the self-sufficient economy for themselves.
Very nice. And what about you, Mr. Manuel Pushli? Who do you think benefits the most from this, what Vershtuk is calling a tactic game? And can't the European bloc safeguard their energy infrastructure? If yes, why did this happen in the very first place? If no, what were they waiting for to secure sensitive infrastructure that if damaged, everyone loses, and even the environment loses here?
Yes, of course. I think that today what happened in this area of between Norway and Denmark is under control of NATO troops. So we can talk about sabotage, and it requires a high knowledge of explosive, of course. But what I would like to say, the goal is to block a European initiative with Russia, which was supposed to work. And this is the message of this sabotage, in fact, is to cut. But today, Europe is seeking for new partners to feed gas and to feed with energy. We are talking about Turkey. We can talk about Algeria, of course, with a pipeline inside the Mediterranean Sea. But be careful, it could be also cut by another initiative. And today, it's difficult to find who is a guilty part of this initiative, of course. But what we can say today is the most important, as soon as you need natural resources to feed your economy, the challenge for all the parties, for all the persons involved in this challenge is, of course, to ensure the high security level of the feeding, It requires forces development, it requires agreement, it requires a lot of steps, and in fact, your bill is increasing too. But the goal is to punish, I'm talking about Europe, the goal is also to punish Germany. We have already seen this kind of scenario in Saudi Arabia, where Iran attacked oil pipes and refineries in the Saudis' land, you know. So don't forget that also in Europe, we don't have a map, but we have a map of several feeding system with gas or natural gas, of course. And some of them are crossing Ukraine. So that's why the goal is to have a peace agreement and to stop hostilities and the war in Ukraine, because some pipes are going through this territory too.
So we are now actually watching live events that is taking place right now with Putin at a signing ceremony to formally annex Ukraine or Ukrainian territories. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has arrived at a signing ceremony in Moscow as he formally annexes 4 more areas of Ukraine. It seems that Putin will preside over the signing ceremony with the Russian-installed heads of the 4 regions in the Kremlin, where he will sign into law the annexations of 4 Ukrainian regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Russia held fake referendums, as the Westerners and Ukrainians are naming it, in these 4 partially occupied areas of Ukraine over the last week in order to claim a mandate for the territorial claims. It comes after the Kremlin announced the referendum earlier. Vladimir Putin is now speaking at the signing ceremony in the Kremlin to mark the formal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions. And this began by talking about the so-called referendum held over the last week in order for Moscow to claim a mandate for Putin's territorial claims. And Putin claims the results have come through that are known. And also the Russian president began talking about the so-called referendum, saying that people have made their choice and it's definitive choice. And Ukraine and the West have denounced the fake referendums and said they will never recognize their legitimacy. And here, let me get back to you, Mr. Verstook, so as to comment on what is happening now.
This move is going to be pretty popular for Russians because, as we know, Russia is mobilizing its men to serve in the army. And, to get those men motivated to fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin needs to produce the results of the so-called special military operation, which has been taking place for more than 200 days. So now Vladimir Putin is showing here we get 4 regions of Ukraine that now is going to be Russia. If you now going to join the army and help the Russian army, we're going to have more Ukrainian regions annexed. That's what Vladimir Putin is trying to say. That's really hawkish move, and we should be worrying about this because Vladimir Putin is showing by this that he's ready to escalate. I think we should be getting prepared for maybe a nuclear strike if Vladimir Putin decides so. We shouldn't be in panic, of course, but we should get prepared for the escalation. Unfortunately, many would want war to be over by now or over by the end of the year. But at the best case scenario, the war will be going until summer next year. And Vladimir Putin is by no way prepared to accept own loss in this war. He wants to have at least some territorial gains, and now we are seeing it. Of course, he wanted more territories to be annexed, but now he shows that he's happy with 4 regions that his army has been able to take control of. And he hopes that this is going to be big accomplishment in the eyes of the Russian society to drive people's nationalism and imperialist sentiment.
Very nice. And what about you, Mrs. Zhang Shanghui? Is this scheme to steer away from Russian energy products, mainly gas, really working? And what other options does Russia have if its products aren't really bought in Europe? They are certainly sold elsewhere, such as India and China, not to mention the national consumption and other direction toward the east and the south.
Yes, there are other possibilities. I mean, to have the resource, to have this kind of energy. But actually, I would wanted to comment a little bit with what's happening now.
Okay.
So we can see that today Russia is entering the new. In a new declaration with a new situation. So, which means that today, if there's kind of more Ukrainian soldiers entering in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, this will be considered as a kind of an invasion. So this is a very crucial event. This is a very crucial moment, and let's see what's going to be going through. But I would like to say that if we look back a little bit in the history, and if we look back on 2014, what happened between Russia and Ukraine, it was kind of similar in 2014. So we can see that Russia, from my point of view, this is really the kind of subject. We can see that Russia is there, like staying here. He didn't really want to invade the whole Ukraine now. It's like there's kind of balancing the power between Russia and Ukraine now. So I think this is kind of his strategy for now. This is more like to counter NATO. It's more like to counter the expansion of the NATO. But do he really want to go to the eastern side or to the western side, more in the western direction? I'm not sure about his position. And when we come back to the supply issue, for the economical supply, for the energy supply, when we look at what's going on today in the Europe situation, there's less gas today, no more petrol with what's happening now with Russia. So this could be a good opportunity for European countries in a diversification of green energy, of polar energy, of solar energy, of hydro energy. So this could be actually another opportunity, I think, for them. And many European countries, we can see that they're in a very passive situation. Is that they are today dependent on what's happening today around with Russia and with Ukraine. They're also very, very dependent with
indeed. Mrs. Zhang Shanghui, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I would have loved also to give the final question to Mr. Manuel Pouchelet, but unfortunately, we ran out of time. Thank you so much, Mr. Manuel Pouchelet, for your thorough analysis, Mr. Verstook as well, and Mrs. Zhang Shanghui. Thank you so much. This is the end, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to our channel. And bye for now.